Hello everybody, my name is Manu S and welcome to another Eternal Essentials here on my channel. Today I want to continue my Eternal Essentials series on power bases and influence after I went over all the power cards in another recent two-part video series, which you can find up here on the right in a card to check out if you haven't seen it yet. I want to go a little further and deeper on the subject this time, as I promised in the series, and talk about actual power bases and examples in decks and influence requirements and power requirements for certain decks. Alright, so first of all I want to start off with this chart. This chart has been, or these charts have been done by Discord's own IReedMinds. He basically took Frank Karsten's an MTG Pro Hall of Famer and mathematician math that he used to determine the proper amount of colored sources in MTG to cast a certain card with a certain color requirement on a given turn. This math is slightly skewed by him factoring in mulligans to 6 and 5, since you mulligan hands that either have too much or too little power sources, while in this game it works a little different. So while these calculations are straight from Frank Karsten's math with his assumptions of an MTG mulligan, we can probably roughly subtract around 1 from each requirement with how different the mulligan is here, because we get only 1 mulligan to 7 with more cards and a guaranteed 2 to 5 power, which makes it a lot more likely to hit your requirements on the second try around, rather than in MTG where you mulligan to 6 and are not guaranteed power in your hand, and then potentially have to mulligan to 5 in a certain amount of cases, while here a lot of your redraw hands are more likely to give you your early requirements than, say, in a Magic mulligan to 6. Alright, so let's look at this briefly. I'll explain it a bit. So we have limited and constructed. I'll focus on the constructed part, but you can check out the limited part here. I'll also put a link to this document underneath the video, so you can check it out and use it as a guideline, since it is actually a really good guideline to help you build better power bases. I'll also link IReedMinds' initial Reddit post that he shared it in, so you can check that out too. There's also a link to Frank Karsten's original MTG article where he explains his methodology and so on, so you can see where he uses assumptions that don't apply to Eternal, and can maybe even adjust his math if you're deep enough into math to actually do that. I am not. Alright, so basically here we have for, say, playing a 1-drop like an Oni Ronin, based on this calculation, you would basically need 18 undepleted red sources. Let's say his math is a bit over the top, given that the redraw differs so much. So basically a lot of any hand that is unkeepable because it has too much or too little power that you redraw has a reasonable chance to hit it. So in this game you're probably fine with 16 to 17 sources to reliably cast your Oni Ronin on turn 1. Also, just to clarify, consistently likely to do so means here 90% chance to do so with your opening hand, basically. So yeah, the goal, as always, usually in these games, is consistency, and Frank Karsten determined consistent as 90% or more. So these numbers are set to have a 90% chance to achieve that goal. So you basically have to ask yourself, if you put a card in your deck, by what turn you are likely to cast it or like want to cast it. For example, there's cards that cost 3 power, but you don't usually want to play them on 3 or don't have to play them on 3, which makes their requirements not force you to have them on 3, but like on 5 or 6, for example. So it's also a question of when you actually want or need to use the card, usually not what it costs, since there's like 1 power cards that you won't use until turn 2 or turn 3, the earliest, like some removal. Like sure, sometimes for example you want a torch on turn 1, but you don't need like a 90% chance to play your torch on turn 1. It's totally fine to have a 90% chance to use it on 2 or 3, because yeah, there won't be a situation where you need to torch on turn 1 90% of the time. It will be much less than 90% of the time that you actually even want to play your torch on turn 1. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, with proactive cards like Oni Ronin, you basically, if it would be reasonable, you wouldn't mind playing your Oni Ronin 100% of the time on turn 1 if you have it in your opening hand. But 100% is not a reasonable goal, simply because past the 90% you would need to add so many red sources to your deck that it has more diminishing returns than it actually helps you get a significantly more consistent Oni Ronin turn 1, which is why he chose the 90% baseline, since that works out very reasonable with like how a deck functions in reality and in practice. Alright, so yeah, you can see the number drops significantly from like turn 1 to turn 2, and then kind of like gradually goes down and kind of flat lines past turn 6. So you can, as I said, subtract like 1 to 2 from all of these values. Like from the 1 drop, it's maybe even fine to like subtract it down to like 16ish, but from the rest I would at best only reduce it by like roughly 1. While the redraw helps the color requirements a bit, it still would make you, especially in like the higher curve spots, make you more likely to having to aggressively redraw hands that are actually good enough to keep and risk getting a worse hand. And so yeah, I think the redraw mainly affects the first like 3 turns maybe, since you get 2 to 5 power, so you probably, depending on your power base, get like around maybe 3 or 3 point something power cards on average on a redraw. Unless you run like a lot of power, then you probably get more like around 4 plus, or like 4-ish power on a redraw. But most decks in this game only run like 25 to 27 actual power cards that are, or like 28 maybe, that are affected by the redraw mechanic, and the rest is stuff like favors and seek power, which is not affected by the redraw, but potentially adds extra power to your redraw hands, since you can get 5 power hands with seek or favor, for example, and you can also get 2 power hands with seeks or favors. So basically what seeks and favors do is they make it more likely on a redraw that you get more than 2 power. I think they significantly reduce that chance of you getting an actual 2 power hand that has only 2 sources of power and nothing else, because you are much more likely to get like a 2 power hand that also has a favor or a seek if you run a bunch of those. which is nice because a lot of decks that run these and run like 30 plus actual power between Seek, Favor, and power cards often are really scared of these like 2 power opening hands, because then you depend on the top of your deck, and if you just don't get your power drops, you just screw and lose the game, while having a higher chance to mulligan into 3 and 4 power opening hands thanks to Seek and Favor makes your opening hands much more consistent, and also your redraws much more safe, basically, to meet the requirements of your deck. So that's also something to keep in mind. And yeah, you can see if you play something like Temple Scribe, you optimally would want like 25 or like, let's say 23 or 24 time sources by turn 2 to reliably play a Temple Scribe on turn 2. Granted, decks that play Temple Scribe often have other things that they can do on 2, so it's not that awful if they play less and they just have a lower than 90% chance to play the Temple Scribe on 2 and just play the Temple Scribe on 3 or 4 later and do something else on 2. But that's kind of like, all these numbers are kind of like what you want to strive for. What Frank Karsten also formulated is basically a rough calculation for like regular cantrips like Inspire. In MTG he counted them for a quarter power source or influence source. Here they probably are a little less because the deck is 25% bigger than a Magic deck. So for Inspire would probably not be like 1 extra power drop and influence source for any given influence. It would probably be more like, I don't know, 0.8 or something. But something like Quarry, for example, would be a lot more because it sees 2 cards and also gives you selection. So something like Quarry, if you already have the influence and the 2 power, is, I'd say, around like 1.5, like playing for Quarry adds like 1.5 to 2-ish sources of any given influence and just straight up power sources to your deck if you aggressively if you use it to aggressively find power drops and or influence for anything that requires more than 1 shadow, more than 1 fire, and any other faction influence that you might be playing, while also providing extra power sources to hit your 3rd power and further. So these cards definitely help you not having to put too much power in your deck while still giving you virtually enough power to run more expensive cards. Also the fact that it reduces the cost of a card slightly helps. So I guess you could count running 4 Quarry at around 2 sources of power and 2 sources of influence past the first shadow and past the first fire influence for cards that you want to use on turn 3 onwards. So that's definitely good, and that also already shows what Quarry adds to a deck on a deeper level in terms of consistency of power, consistency of influence, and so on. And yeah, as you can see, hitting cards that cost like that have a requirement of 3 influence already gets pretty steep in terms of requirements. And what you can basically also use this chart for kind of, is how much power you need to simply hit 3 power by turn 3, for example, or like 2 power by turn 2, which basically is like the minimum power you need, you can run in the game is 25. So running 25 guarantees you more than 90%, gives you like more than 90% chance to have 2 power by turn 2, or actually 100%, because if you redraw you always have 2 power. So basically, thanks to the redraw, you have 100% chance on that, and then like down the road you have a pretty good chance to hit 3 and 4 still, especially with the redraw. So yeah, that kind of shows that the decks like Jido that only ran the minimum of 25 power have like a pretty good chance to hit their third power on turn 3 for their assembly lines and Shadowland guides, and only run a bit short maybe on hitting that fourth power on turn 4 for the queen, which you might have also noticed in playing the deck, that the deck sometimes struggles to hit that fourth power for queen, which is why a lot of people only run 2 or 3 queens and not 4 anymore, especially because drawing multiples can be really lackluster. I myself went down to 3 because I frequently had these situations with like stuck on 3 power, having a queen or 2 in hand, and if it was literally anything else, would be so much better. And yeah, that's also why rally is so much better, because the deck is so much more consistent at being able to play a rally than it is to play a queen, and rally has a lot of other upsides that are already discussed in the video. But yeah, for example, looking at a deck like Recano, for example, the deck probably wants to hit like its fourth power by turn 4 like 80 to 90% of the time, because that's where the deck peaks. Even if it doesn't have a Hammer of Might, it still probably wants to play like 2 2-drops, or like a 3 power card and a 1 power card like Leaf Open, a Torch, or a Finest Hour to interact in combat or with an opposing relic weapon and stuff like that. So basically, as you can see here, if we discount the 3 by turn 3 a bit to like 27, then in order to basically hit its 3 drops by turn 3 90% of the time, the deck would need 27 to 28 power on average. And while it wants to hit 4 like 80 to 90% of the time, and even wants to hit 5, like, I don't exactly know the exact percentage it wants to hit that, but basically any time it has a plate. So you would have to calculate the probability of having a plate in your hand by turn 5 and match the probability of having a plate by turn 5 with a slightly quadratious number, like percentage, to have your 5th power by turn 5, because plate is still strongest on turn 5, and you basically want to probably have a 90% chance to play your plate on turn 5 if you have it, but you don't need to have 5 power 90% of the time by turn 5, simply because you won't have a plate 90% of the time by turn 5. So you only need to have the 5th power on turn 5 90% of the time that you also have a plate in your hand. So that basically brings me to a spot where my Recano, for example, with like 2 5-drops runs 28 power, which is okay-ish if we look at these numbers. But once you run like 3 or 4 5-drops, I would advocate to at least run 29 power to have a reasonable chance to hit your 4th and 5th power to curve into your hammers and plates consistently. It's kind of the same reason why, for example, my Stone Sky aggro deck runs 29 power, because it has 3 Obliterate that it wants to curve into, and it also has the Flame Blast that you usually want to be able to cast for 5 or 6. And you also have Pyronite that you don't mind activating on 6. So the deck definitely has a fairly high probability for wanting a 5th power on turn 5, and is even fine with having a 6th power in a game simply because it has Flame Blast and Pyro Knight to use the power on. So basically has like some inbuilt contingency. So does Rakano if it runs Pyro Knight basically. So it's nice to have something to do with that extra power if you don't only hit your like 5th power drop for your blade, but also happen to have that 6th power. Then you can use it on a Pyro Knight, for example, or in Stonescar Aggro on a Flame Blast, which is definitely nice that this like extra power past your core requirements gives you some kind of value still, lets you do something at some point. For example, also in Rakano and in the Stonescar Aggro, there's 1 to 2 monuments, so you can, while you have, for example, in a Rakano deck with 2 Emerald Monument and 29 power, while you have 29 power to hit your 5th power drop, you're suddenly only looking at 27 power when calculating the chance to hit your 6th power drop, because 2 of the power cards will not be powers anymore, they will be monuments, and you can just use them as spells, as actual cards rather than as power. So that's the like nice thing of monuments in these types of decks. They give you a good amount to hit your 4th and 5th power, while at the same time providing contingency against hitting the 6th. So they allow you to increase your percentage to hit your 3rd, 4th, 5th power without actually increasing the chance to hit your 6th as well. Because the problem normally is, if you add a power to your deck, the percentage to hit all your power drops goes up. So not only your 3rd, 4th, 5th. We don't really care about the 1st and 2nd, especially with the redraw, because the redraw guarantees you the first 2. So, but we need to be able to hit our 3rd with redraws that give us 2 power basically. And then we play off the top and need enough power density in our deck to hit our 3rd and 4th, for example. Especially our 3rd and then our 4th. But yeah, so normally if we add a power, the percentage for all of these turns goes up. But if we add a monument, only the percentages for 3, 4, and 5 go up. Because by 6, the 6th power might be a monument rather than a regular power, because if we have 27 actual power in our deck and add 2 monuments, we have the likelihood of hitting our 6th power as if we were running 27 power, not as if we were running 29, but we still have the chance to hit our 3rd, 4th, and 5th as if we were playing 29 power. So that's like a really great thing that monuments can do for your deck. Also, I mean, you have to play a deck that can make good use of the monuments, so they are like a decent card, but decks like the Stonescar Aggro deck and Rakano are very well set up to do this. Slower decks usually play favors to accomplish a similar thing, while a favor still provides you the 6 power drop, it also provides you some marginal value in addition. Plus, you can potentially play a few more favors more aggressively in a power-hungry and slower deck than you can play monuments in an aggressive curvy deck. Because if you run too many, you risk crippling your early game too much. But especially because of the redraw mechanic, since the monuments count for your redraw, so you risk redrawing into too many hands with too many monuments early. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, that covers like the requirements per turn and the magic of monuments basically. The next thing I want to do is look at the top 8 decks from yesterday's ETS and look at their influence and power requirements and check how well they line up with these requirements to see how good the state of like the average mana base, like power base, influence base is in this game, and also talk about how the power base would need to be adjusted to be more appropriate for the deck's requirements if it is insufficient.